Madam Chair, this debate is about two things. Number one, whether or not tax exemptions can be made a conditional one. And number two, what kind of choices and what kind of things, policies, should the state endorse? In my speech, you hear three things. Number one, why is a necessary approach in order to move along with society and allow individuals to be in a more inclusive framework. Number two, why it is in the best interest of these churches and these religious organizations, and why we need to, as a state, facilitate these changes. And number three, I'll tell you the overall positive effects this will have on society as a whole. Before that, let's walk through the mechanism of it. We think that this will obviously operate in countries where homosexuality is legal, because if we operate in a country where homosexuality is bad, then obviously we wouldn't want to punish churches for being complicit to a crime or abetting of something that is illegal, right? That. Also, we think this is a conditional requirement. Tax exemption can be a conditional one because it's a valid trade-off, right? Because you want to allow ceremonies. It's either you sit down, it's either you allow these discriminative and these homophobic ceremonies to happen, or you allow participation, or you allow a more palatable approach to a society as a whole that will gain traction, that will be the more inclusive framework for you to gain more followers and actually increase your subscription. This condition extends, of course, to the clause of not abusing gays, even if they participate in your churches or your organizations. It extends to recognizing marriages. It extends to not abandoning them or trying to explicitly change them within these religious organizations. Done. Let's move on to the first substantive. Why is it a necessary approach in order to move along with society, in order to be the most inclusive framework? We think at which point you say my church or my mosque is exclusive for heterosexuals or exclusive for men or of this nature, you are not serving with the purpose of your own church, or you're not serving the own purpose of your religion, right? We think there's already a consensus within the state and society that marriage between homosexuals are recognized, right? Or discrimination is wrong. We think it's necessary for churches to move along with these ideas as well. Why are these rights fundamental? Because it's not just about you marrying someone you love, it's about being able to choose, and you being able to choose someone you want to unite with without being guilt-tripped into thinking that you are less of a human being for doing so. Sick myth. The state has why do churches specifically have to move along with this rhetoric? Because these churches, especially in societies that are conservative, have the power to legitimize and endorse. At which point you endorse homophobic sentiments, and at which point you endorse, look, discrimination is acceptable when you are a Muslim, because that is what makes you a Muslim. We think that's abhorrent. Even Pope Francis, right? Let's talk about the top-down approach as well. When Pope Francis came out and said, look, maybe gays don't go to hell. There are a lot of things you can question about it. This is open for discussion. It was never finite, right? It was never infinite, right? These kind of things actually do gravitate create a change within society. That you becoming a Muslim or being a gay Muslim does not have to guilt trip you. Sick. Let's look at the second idea. Why is it in the best interest of these churches to do so, and why do we need to facilitate this? As I've told you before, right? Endorsing something homophobic or endorsing something exclusive means that you do not want to include more subscribers, that you do want to push away certain segments of society. Let's look at the trend analysis. Back then, when black people or the Native Americans were oppressed, the Christians used the Bible interpretation of what it meant of slavery, right? Allowing them to, hey, maybe suddenly this means that it's justified for you to treat Native Americans less because they are not supposed to be considered part of your religion. All of these things have gravitated. A lot of churches have gravitated away from that, and we think it's necessary to make sure that churches in general have to follow along with that, right? Because if you look at the Episcopalian Church recently with a female priest, it's not as if these things will suddenly antagonize religious individuals, right? Religious individuals, especially when you have a more moderate and palatable approach, will be able to gravitate towards this kind of idea, and that's when you are able to change the rhetorics that are necessarily powerful. Sick. We don't tell them that freedom of religion is contingent upon you choosing something that is contingent on it being conditional, right? The New York mosque, for example, had a recent gay imam. If this side of the house wants to say that all of these things are already sufficient, we think that's disgusting. Especially when you have people like Scott Lyman in churches also saying, look, gays not only deserve to be not only deserve to go to hell, but you, if you want to remain religious, you must kill them. We think that it is in the best interest of these churches in order to combat that rhetoric, if they want to gain more traction, in order to have more subscribers, in order to make sure that all of these individuals are able to discuss about issues without being so discriminative that they forget the fundamental core of their religion itself. Before I move on, Gemma.
Okay. Would you also happily remove tax exemption status from charities that cater exclusively to African Americans at the exclusion of white people from equal access to services?
We think that at which point one particular segment has been so discriminated in society. Yeah, we're fine. We're fine to make it conditional as long as it is for a social good. We think that's necessary for society as a whole, right? Let's look at this. Let's look at this last idea. How will this be a positive impact on society as a whole? Because a lot of people who go to church are not only followers of certain rhetorics or become, believers of certain rhetorics, but some people become complicit as well. Because they do not want to be seen as less of a Muslim, they have to side with the mosque, right? Because they believe if they do not do so, right, suddenly now they will be accused of being less of a Muslim. They are never forced to take a stance. We think at which point you give them leeway to decide whether or not, hey, I should side with a more peaceful approach, or they're never able, or they're never forced to take a stance. Is money more important, or is making sure that individuals don't get excluded from your religion more important? We think they need to do this. And why? Because society as a whole will begin to normalize themselves with this idea. It's when you are able to reach out to individuals on the ground, is when you are able to teach principles of your religion at its core. Number two, we think it's also a counter narrative to the rhetorics that currently exist. You do not need to be a straight Muslim in order to be a Muslim, right? We think the generations have come far beyond the last decades and centuries. Even if bigots continue to exist, we think there is already a mitigating factor. Why? Because you are able to go into those places where these rhetorics are spread the most, where individuals think they should be empowered by their religion, even though they are not, right? We think the fence sitters, the individuals you want to protect, are the people who we should think about. Go with government.
Madam Speaker, we don't think that the billions of people whose religious salvation is based on the rejection of certain individuals or the beliefs of certain individuals, or anything to homosexuals to accept them into their churches or into their homes for any reason. But even if they did, Madam Speaker, do you think a forceful move by the state to force these individuals into these churches does far more harm to the long-term acceptance of these communities and a fight for rights, which you think is far more important than being forced into your neighborhood mosque or your church? I have a few arguments. Before that, a few ones that stand out. The first thing she said is, oddly enough, this is going to be better for these churches. We would say a few things. Firstly, it's not the state's goal to maximize church membership. We don't think that should be the aim of any state. But secondly, in the instance that it would be better for these churches, they would do so anyway. We don't think this move would be needed. And thirdly, they actually don't account for the millions of people that will leave the church once these people start attending their churches. So I think you probably should account for that when you talk about membership. But secondly, and more importantly, the main concept, like the main crux of her speech is this: you want to change beliefs of these Muslims or these Christians who reject homosexuals. You actually don't do that. Like in your most flimsiest version of your policy, you said churches can no longer publicly say that homosexuality is bad. Sure, but they can still continue to hold those beliefs inside those churches. The scripture still remains unchanged. The core tenets of the belief, which has been around for 2,000 to 3,000 years, still remain the same. So actually forcing these people into your churches doesn't actually change beliefs of individuals about them. It only makes these individuals far more antagonistic about these people and are seen as a state imposition within their churches. But then she said, well, you shouldn't be allowed to guilt trip people in the world, right? That's a bad thing. That is absurd. In that, if you are allowed to guilt trip people, you can never actually oppose anyone who believes anything that is opposed to what you believe in. Like all Islamic people now can never oppose or establish their religion because in some instances contradicts Christianity and that it makes Christians feel bad. And where do you actually draw the line saying that you have no ability to challenge individuals' opinion and say that I don't think homosexuality is a choice that you ought to engage in? We don't think that's an arbitrary metric that states should impose on individuals. Firstly, on a principle level, why do we think that religions can discriminate internally, right? Sit down. The first and most uncontroversial statement here is that we think democracies have a freedom of association. E.g., individuals who set up private institutions offer the ability to screen people who enter those institutions. You don't think religions at any point in time sign a social contract or took taxes from individuals and said that we owe social utility to you. But secondly, in the instance that these are private institutions who do receive tax exemptions, we think a lot of other institutions also receive tax exemptions which are public utilities. Like what? Like charities which do only specific things and don't cater to all individuals. E.g., African American charities who help only certain sections of society, even though, for example, women or Native Americans may also be disadvantaged. So there's no actual thing, there's nothing to say that just because you receive a tax exemption that you must be a social utility to all people. You receive tax exemption in the instance that you provide social utility to some or large group of people, something that churches already do, right? But lastly, we think the freedom of religion is an important thing in the world. Like in the instance that you accept that a freedom of religion actually exists, membership to any religion is based on exclusion. Like that's the definition of differentiation between religion. Like why don't you also force all churches to accept Muslims who are not Christians into your churches, or the other way around? Like in the instance that you accept that religion is important individuals and they should be able to define the ideas that they want to pursue and then collectivize the individuals who also hold the same beliefs in their path to salvation, to destroy the ability of millions of people whose salvation or faith is dependent upon them rejecting certain ideals which they think that God has told them. So you know what? You accept that freedom of religion exists and freedom and religion is defined on exclusions. You tell me why this particular exclusion is different from all other exclusions that religion already defines in Max.
Do you think I'm less of a Muslim just because my church accepts homosexual men?
No, you're not. Like you can. That's the thing. If you want to be Muslim, you can practice that in your home or in some Islamic institution that does accept homosexuals, which is a trend currently that you've accepted in your speeches. You don't think all churches or mosques should be forced to accept like Muslims or Christians or homosexuals into your churches? That's your policy, right? First, what does removing tax exemptions actually do? I've already told you that just because you're a tax exempt body doesn't mean that you're a public utility. We think many tax exempt institutions like churches do a lot of public good in things like charities, things like food kitchens, things like providing employment to millions of people around the world. What does your policy do? In the event that a big church actually or medium-sized church decides to reject this policy because it's fundamentally opposed to the core tenets of their church, their financial capacity is actually reduced considerably. What do I mean? Like in the instance that you remove tax exemptions, we will presume that this church is not taxed as a corporation, right? What are the corporate taxes in like Western countries like? 30 to 40%. So literally you take 30 to 40% away from all churches who decide to reject this policy. What actually happens? For the big to medium-sized churches, who can probably now still survive by rejecting a policy, will do so, except they will start doing the social good that they currently did to fill the state gaps, right? In many institutions, you've seen large organizations like the Salvation Army, for example, come into the developing world or even the developed world, fill state gaps with providing things like food or soup kitchens or charities, for example, which help certain disadvantaged groups. The first thing that these churches then call is this social good that is currently funded by these tax exemptions. So in the institution that a big church decides to reject your policy, millions of poor people who are helped by these churches who fill state gaps the state cannot fill are left for the lurch, right? You never told me why the rights of these poor people to fill their basic needs of sustenance is somehow less important than the arbitrary conception of being able to go to a church that you want to go to. But secondly, we also think like small and medium churches now start charging people money for admission into their church. We think that's a bad thing. In a world where religion is used by the poor people as the only guiding light in their world, often societal collectivization is the only source of happiness for these individuals. We don't think these churches should be forced to charge money from poor people who form often the biggest part of their audience, right? But thirdly, what do you do with big and medium and local churches, right? The actual churches that you affect are medium and local sized churches who now reject your policy because it is seen as a state imposition not on them but on their scripture and what they believe for thousands of years. You destroy these churches and make these individuals extremely antagonistic to the movement. That's why I come on to my third argument, right? Why does this harm the progression for the LGBT community? Because the world that opposition wants to live in is not a world in which religion openly accepts all gay individuals. It's a world in which religion is indifferent to the progression of rights of homosexuals, right? I mean, that's a far more convenient way of achieving progress for most homosexuals or any minorities, right? And actually, you've actually seen a trend of religion accepting these individuals. Some examples pointed out by the Prime Minister herself. Things like the Anglican Church has already ordained a gay priest, for example. Now the referendums in the US have already accepted gay marriage as a right. Or things like anti-discrimination laws exist around the Western world. For example, the Pope has been the first to temper his attitude towards the LGBT community. What does your move actually do? By targeting the small, mid-sized conservative churches or Christians at large, by telling them you cannot practice your religion unless you accept these people, you only antagonize these people in the long run, right? You push moderate people and moderate churches who are currently indifferent towards the LGBT movement and show them that the LGBT movement is out to attack. So even those people who are indifferent or currently don't care or don't mind the progression of rights in other areas like marriage, for example, which is delineated from things like religion, now are buying into the rhetoric of conservatives who say that there is an attack on the Christian nation by the LGBT movement, right? You only alienate in the long run large numbers of people who subscribe to these churches. Like even if they're forced to accept these people, they feel alienated and they feel that they're currently under attack by the LGBT movement, right? We think you make it harder for the progression of rights in things like civil unions, in things like marriages, or things like adoption law, which often need the political consent of these individuals to pass in the first place. When you piss them off for an arbitrary right to attend a church where you wouldn't be accepted anyway, even in the instance that you were forced to enter it, extremely proud to oppose.
How are you good to go? Dear Lord, I have sinned. I've murdered, I've raped, I've used drugs. This priest that listened to my confession will forgive me for all the crimes that I've done to humanity, but will not forgive me if I am gay.
Shame.
This is the moral hypocrisy that they institutionalize. They allow churches to define a man is less of a Muslim if he is gay. A man, ladies and gentlemen, cannot unite with his family because he is gay. And the problem in this debate was they to a certain extent considered this is a fundamental right that needs to be protected, but say that it needs to remain one that is limited. Let's allow organic forces to change it. We think it's high time that the state cannot side with the bigots and cannot give a blanche card for these bigots to freely, uninterruptedly discriminate this individual. Let's visit the case that came out from opposition. We think, ladies and gentlemen, in their work, if these churches naturally do this, all of this harm of pissing off lobbyists, pissing off bigots will still exist. And how would you respond to that? Because even in your work, you allow these churches to make this natural progression. You, sit down, madam. Let's talk about what do. You allow, ladies and gentlemen, to religion to discriminate individuals, to brainwash a certain population by saying that homosexuality is wrong. And Bunny told you, the problem with the homosexual movement right now, that it drags people to be complicit. Just because I sit on the bench of the church for 15 years, ladies and gentlemen, I am normalized to believe that a gay man is one that is not equal than me, that he's a sinner. He chose to live that life. What do we do in our work is that we allow these individuals or counter-narrative to exist. Bunny told you that a right to marry is a fundamental one. If there's a societal consensus that already allows you to marry and already accepts the biological design and say that it's wrong to discriminate you, ladies and gentlemen, we think that the state needs to facilitate you in finding that home. The state cannot say that these churches will continuously be allowed to endorse or to say that you are not equal and still get away with it. We think the point at which you are bigot, you need to pay a social cost. That's what we are doing under our world, ladies and gentlemen. But then he ran his argument about financial capacity. Look, this is where the moral hypocrisy is even worse. The point in which you come outright say that the reason why I don't want to help the poor people or the desperate people is because of my ego or my need to not take a position on homosexuality is something that I cannot compromise. That's when, ladies and gentlemen, they will lose. That's when we think the homosexual argument will play out the narrative. Because we can ask, you are the idiots who said that slavery, you are the idiots that changed the definition of slavery. You are the guys who moderated punishment on adultery. Why are you continuously punishing this individual for his biological design, ladies and gentlemen? And if you choose to do that, we think you need to pay a social cost. That's why the financial capacity just highlights the ego and the moral hypocrisy under their paradigm. But before I move on,
Can you please elucidate to this house? How is it when you make the Catholic Church perform a gay marriage, it immediately transcends into individual believers changing their perceptions towards the homosexual community?
I will do that in my argument. Let's do a couple more rebuttals, ladies and gentlemen. Why is it important for the church to do this and for the church to be endorsed by the state? Because this state came to a social consensus already. If people choose to be exclusive, they are committing a negative right. Like for example, the priority of smoking, right, is one that you prioritize the hit that you get from the nicotine over the immediate need of your body. It's one is a negative right, but the state allows you to do that. But the only trade-off that you do is that you pay money to the state, ladies and gentlemen. Similarly here, if your decision to prioritize your ego above the immediate need of a man, ladies and gentlemen, and his entrance to your state, you need to pay the same price. But more importantly, the reason why this needs to happen is that some churches are complicit. They just don't take a position on homosexuality because they don't want to be controversial. But if churches believe that they need this exemption, they need to do this, they will accept this. And what does this mean? It gives a home to this men. It tells men that, you know what, you can still be equal. But the most important thing is, ladies and gentlemen, a lot of people just assume that just because you're a Muslim, man, you cannot be gay. Or I'm a Muslim man, I cannot have a gay brother. He chose to be like that. These kind of churches allow different interpretation to happen. Nicely leads to my argument here, ladies and gentlemen. Why? Because this today day and age, we have predefined religion. We have said that it's not one that interacts people on a social scale. We have told people that it's your definition and your personal connection with God. We think churches are personal space and public space. And we think the state has a right to define, ladies and gentlemen, how these places are being celebrated. That's why we give, we give tax exemption to orphanages, ladies and gentlemen, and not to your tutti frutti store. Because we realize that these people's rights need to be protected even more. Because, okay, listen to this, Gemma. Because a Catholic man does not suffer the consequences of being a bigot. But a man who suffers to find a home and a religious solace, ladies and gentlemen, suffers because he's continuously told that he's less of a man, that he's less of a religious man. We think there's a problem. What do we do under our paradigm? Because churches have changed their definition all along the way and have interpreted Bible differently, we allow different interpretation of Bible. We allow counter narrative to exist within churches. Why do churches need to do this? And these are instances where, ladies and gentlemen, a lot of the homosexual community can go and interact with the people on the ground, can tell people their stories. And these stories, ladies and gentlemen, in very, very bigoted Catholic church won't even gain entrance. And we think that's a problem and it's very bad. Like, let's look into the way in which religion have changed interpretation. For example, the Christian definition of slavery is one that led to the occupation of the Native Americans. They changed it. And these are behaviors, ladies and gentlemen, that have changed human beings years and years. If the people in this room do believe that we as a state need to treat men equally and cannot discriminate these individuals, then you have to tell me why is it an inalienable right for these people to pay money or to pay more money. We think there needs to be a difference within individuals that are supportive of the state and supportive with the cause of the state, ladies and gentlemen. Because the reason why this happens is because these are agents who help actualize what the state perceives or the state envisions, right? Because if the state envisions you to not treat people based on their sexual preference, if these people help to actualize them and help to facilitate their rights, these people need to be given the comparative edge. Because that's when incentive will be given to individuals to be more palatable to homosexual. In their world, ladies and gentlemen, you have the right to be egoistic. You have the right to be uninterrupted. Because why? Because you think that it's all right for you to do that. We think we break that idea. The moment in which the state sits down and allow you to normalize and allow the Catholic Church or the bigger church to tell you what to do, you won't take an action. This is a side that listens and acts in line with the state, ladies and gentlemen, and protects the homosexual more than them.
Well, Madam Speaker, I hope everybody in the room recognises the irony of me being the one who's going to get up and explain what religion is. The suggestion that making people feel morally inferior to yourself is something the state ought prohibit must extend to the removal of all religious rights. Necessarily, by being a Catholic and endorsing Catholicism and endorsing the Bible, you make Muslims feel morally inferior to you because you will not let them join your church because you believe their faith is wrong, because you believe they made a stupid and incorrect decision by choosing to believe in Islam and not choosing to believe in Catholicism. Obviously, the reverse is also true.
the very nature of religion or any group that's based on exclusion is that you must condemn other people's choices. And they need to realize the extension of this principle. Is it wrong, Mr. Speaker, for me to believe and purport the idea that I am morally superior to people in this room who choose to drink and smoke? Is that wrong, and would you prevent it in society? No, because the state should allow people to make choices. We agree. That doesn't mean those choices need to be made free from any questioning, free from any scrutiny, free from any capacity to defend the choice that you make, right? So the state does do that. The state allows people to become married if they are gay. We think the state, in the instance it doesn't, ought to do that. The question in this debate is, should religion have to endorse and uncritically accept that choice? We say no, and they need to actually engage with the extension of their principle, which at the moment in this debate sucks. So I'm going to ask the question, to whom do gay people and any people have a rights claim? Is it to churches, private institutions who choose to group together and believe and purport the ideals that they choose to? Or is it to the state, the institution that is in fact there to represent the rights of individuals and protect their choices? We believe it's to the state. And that's why we endorse, as I said, the move towards state recognition of homosexual rights. That doesn't extend to forcing that upon a church. And let me explain to you why. Because there are other churches, Mr. Speaker. If you walk into one particular Catholic parish and you say, hello, I'm a proud gay man and I would like to sign up and I would like to come to your church, and they say, fuck off. You know what you can do? You can walk down the street to a different church. There's plenty of them around, plenty in Sydney, certainly in my country, and you can be that gay man in that church and you can believe the thing you want to believe. And that's the reason why your right or your claim to being a part of that particular religion and having that religion endorse every single choice you make is absolutely preposterous in this debate. They've never actually engaged in that. So I'd really like them at some point to defend what their principled stance actually is. Let's move on, and I'm going to try and calm down for a second. They claim that the reason why we ought to preference the homosexual in this case, and not the Catholic, is because they don't suffer from being a bigot, and the gay person suffers every day from not being able to have a church ceremony. Wrong. First of all, they do suffer from being a bigot. People who are bigots are critiqued all of the time by society. Religion is critiqued. People have to defend their decision to not endorse homosexuality all of the time. And that's the very reason why many individuals have made decisions to change their beliefs. But secondly, what about the Catholic man who is forced to sit in a church and watch two gay men get married on the pulpit and believes he's going to hell because he didn't do anything to prevent that? What about the suffering of that person? Because if you believe in a world where you extend rights to people to actually believe religion, then you need for them to be able to believe the things that their religion purports. So when Max gets up here and very cockily says, am I less of a Muslim because I choose to accept homosexuality? I don't believe you are, but that's not the question in today's debate. The question is, would you believe that if you genuinely believe the scriptures of Islam or of Catholicism? And the answer is yes, Mr. Speaker. Of course you would. You would believe you were less of a Catholic, you would believe you weren't going to heaven, and probably people in your church would also believe the very same thing. So the suggestion that these people have more rights simply by virtue of the fact that Catholics don't suffer is preposterous. Then he says, no, the problem in this debate is about churches being hypocritical because you can walk in and be a murderer, but you can't be a gay man. Preposterous. Every single church where confession is a thing will also accept you being a homosexual if you say that you sinned and want to resolve that thing. That's why there are many openly gay priests. The reason they're endorsed by the church is because they're not practicing being gay, because they're trying to make choices that are in line with their religious scripture. So the suggestion that they don't accept homosexuality as a thing is incorrect. They don't accept you going around and actually acting upon it in the same way that they'll forgive you for being a murderer and for having sinned if you show a genuine remorse for that sin. So that's also nonsense. But also, what is the interest of the state in ensuring that religions are consistent or principally consistent? I'm not really sure. Go ahead.
Okay, some churches will remain being conservative, while others might be liberal. Why are you allowing the same tax policy for both of them? What kind of incentive do you create for people to moderate?
Yes, okay, Max. Because the tax exemption is not based on whether or not we endorse the beliefs of the church. If that were true, presumably, again, you would never want to give a tax exemption to any religion, because to do so would be to endorse the belief, every single one of them, that they purport. The reason we give tax exemption, and this is where the case completely falls apart, is because churches or religious institutions or charities for that matter provide some social utility that the state is incapable of doing on its own. The reason we give a tax exemption to the Catholic Church is because they provide actual tangible social good, and that money is translated to real people who couldn't access those services otherwise. And here's where Max completely falls flat in this debate. He gets up and says, why shouldn't you have to pay for your choices? If you want to be a bigot in a church, why shouldn't you pay more to do it? Because it's not the person in the Catholic Church who pays this money. It's the poor person who no longer gets access to that charity that no longer takes place. It's the person who goes to that soup kitchen that's closed down, Max. That's the person who pays in your world, and you've never defended why that person's right is inferior to the right of the gay person who you claim has the right to show up at a church and have every single thing they do accepted by those people. But in the final part of my speech, I want to look at reality. Reality is that churches are becoming more accepting. And then when he gets up and says, that's an evidence that this won't be a controversial policy, that's nonsense. That's evidence that we need not engage in this policy to achieve the outcome they want. Well, what is the outcome of their policy? They claim, oh, well, people will accept it and they'll share their one-to-one stories. Excuse me, people will feel better about it. No. The vast majority of churches will reject your policy, will give up on tax exemptions, will stop providing the services, and you'll make literally no change to their belief about homosexuals, but for making them angry at those people and more dogmatic in their views. The people who do change and do accept these things because they need tax exemptions will perform the gay marriage, will hate the people in the church, will condemn their choices privately, and those people will be none the better from accessing your policy in this debate. The outcome of your policy is to make the lives of the individual gay people you claim to protect worse, because you put them into a religion that is more antagonistic towards them, that hates them for forcing them into that position, and also to make the lives of every person who accesses a religious charity much, much worse, at the point at which you do that, we think you absolutely lose this debate. We oppose.
Ladies and gentlemen, no one knows where religion came from. No one knows why so many people believe in that imaginary friend. There are so many harms that exist, but we do know what states are for. Secondly, we do know why states do or do not endorse certain things. Thereby, states regularly make sure that the organizations within the state are encouraged only when they comply with the moral standards. They make sure that those organizations are not encouraged and those organizations do not get any assistance in terms of gaining more followers or traction, the point at which they violate the rights of these significant people, right? The point at which they're exclusionary in nature. Now, that was the fundamental core that this team still hasn't engaged with, right? Therefore, they made the claim that, oh, you know what, tax is a sort of unconditional privilege because they provide tangible social services. We believe that's very simplistic, right? Black Panthers also provided tangible social services. KKK also provides tangible social services. But those are services based on exclusion and oppression, and those are not moralities that we endorse in the world today. Those are not moralities states are supposed to endorse. So move on to the endorsement debate and tell us why states are supposed to endorse these things anyway. If the point at which these organizations fail, we're absolutely happy with them going into ruins with their imaginary friend who exists only to discriminate. We don't want that sort of thing to be encouraged by the state, and that is the core principle that they still haven't engaged with. Therefore, no, tax is not an unconditional privilege. Only religious organizations gain it only because they have that sort of traction, and that's something we want to crack down on. We don't want them to perpetuate this tradition of discrimination, right? Now, secondly, they say, oh, you know what, they can just join another church. Now, this debate is about people who believe a certain version of a certain religion with so many options available. For some reason, they choose to subscribe into one version, and this is where your arguments are even more relative, right? Therefore, they need to be within it. They believe the essence and the definition and the manifestations of the word God within that particular version is very important to them. The point at which these churches,
discriminate against these people, we ask ourselves one question: does the state encourage that sort of discrimination? We also ask ourselves the second question: does that sort of encouragement seep into the society and turns into an infectious disease? The point at which the answer is yes to both of these questions, we say the state should at least no longer encourage these things, right? Only because these religious institutions have entrenched their powers for hundreds of thousands of years now. We simply do not accept the tyranny of oppression and exclusion, right? Therefore, that's where all the that's all the things that Gemma talked about, right? But before I move on,
When gays are excluded from churches and excluded from their social utilities, it's probably easier for them to say, shrug it off and say, hey, I'll move to the next church. It's probably different from trying to shrug off getting lynched by the KDK or the Black Panthers, right?
the point at which we're talking about problems that exist at different points of generation, you can't tell me the guy who got lynched by Black Panthers simply decides the fact is gay, homosexual, or habitually get assaulted, right? But the point is simply not about whether or not you die. The point is about how you feel and how the society around you makes you feel, how your mother and father treats you because they have heard something from the church. The point is also about how all these thousands of people cannot make a legitimate choice, and most importantly, the point is about whether or not that repressive process has been encouraged actively by the state, simply because you provide this one benefit of some sort of utility, right? But that's very harmful. And as I deal with my examples, it will become even more clear, right? Now let's move on to the whole example about what sorts of organization we do or do not allow, right? So they say, hey, you allow black NGOs at the point of exclusion. We tell you, you know what? Affirmative action and entrenchment of oppression are two very different things. The point at which certain organizations entrench already existing oppression, we do not encourage them. On the other hand, if certain organizations choose to provide social benefit to certain demographics, we're completely fine with that, right? And that's why we don't allow Black Panther to exist. That's why we don't allow KKK to exist. We don't have a problem with Salvation Army, the point at which they accept our policy, right? But we will not encourage Salvation Army, the point at which they don't. But more importantly, let's deal with more pertinent harms, right? When you say, oh, they go to Africa and save people. No, bullshit. You know, when they go to Africa, what they do? Just last year, the law in Nigeria banning homosexuality was passed. Just last year, people in Nigeria actually mobbed and lynched homosexuals. And the whole pretext of that was one American priest who went to Nigeria and lobbied for changing the law, right? And this is what they do. This is how harmful their beliefs are. And this is how their beliefs manifest, especially in the countries that you're talking about. So don't tell me social utilities are more important than the rights of these people, and how in these countries, these people actually die, the point at which they go against the church only because there is existing entrenchment. You're only further in their entrenchment, and tell me why government needs to endorse that sort of thing. But secondly, let's move on to the clash about whether or not people will change their beliefs, right? We have already told you people will change their beliefs, and we have seen that from the demonstrative effect. That is not a significant majority, but that is a significant minority. We tell you people essentially want to change their beliefs. But secondly, they haven't engaged with the fact that this has happened again and again, right? Moral compass of Bible is disastrous. Moral compass of any religion is disastrous. They have actively encouraged slavery, right? The church has actively encouraged go to Native America and civilize and kill those people because that's what Jesus wants, right? That's the sort of narrative that churches used to purport, right? They used to purport this sort of narratives that women are supposed to stay under your feet and they're not supposed to go and do jobs and go and do constructive things. They have not engaged with that. They have not engaged with that comparative. When we told you, even Bible, even these religions don't have a rigid moral compass as opposed to the claim that they make. Very habitually, they keep changing those compasses. You know when Native American killing stopped? When this Spanish monarch decided it should stop. When he made sure it has to stop. And when he sent people to make sure that it has to stop. And that's the sort of thing that we're talking about. State has an imperative because it has a capability. But the more pertinent question is, what sort of things, what sort of values do you encourage that seep into the society and destroy lives of people, and how much they can actualize themselves and things that they believe in, right? Therefore, we tell you the top-down approach actually works. We have given you all those examples how top-down approach is the easiest way. The point at which the manager of your imaginary friend tells you, hey, this is fine. Everyone starts believing that thing. It's ironic, but that's how it works, right? That's the top-down approach that we talked about. We have also told you that there is precedence of these things happening all the time. We have told you about the very core principle. But more importantly, we have told you, we're not saying it's going to change tomorrow or day after tomorrow. Like any other social change, it might take a while. But the point at which government does not do something, government has failed in terms of its own moral compass. But more importantly, this debate is about removing tax rates. This debate is not about clamping down on churches actively and burning them down and bringing them down. Although many people would probably be happy with that. But more importantly, this debate is about telling these churches, what you're doing is fine, therefore we're going to encourage you and give you tax exemption and make you richer. The question is whether you do or do not encourage those things. Thank you.
Where government missed the comparative in this debate was that this wasn't a generic debate about imposing policies upon an institution that will respond to policies in a direct manner. We talked about religions and communities that form around beliefs and central tenets that they grow their lives upon. Therefore, it wasn't enough for them to simply say that just because you force institutions to practice certain values and to marry certain people, they will immediately translate to their individual followers wanting to believe those beliefs as well. We think we gave you many reasons as to why there'll be a great disassociation between individual followers with the tenets that you propose that government legislation will impose onto these individuals. We don't think there was a sufficient response on that side of the house. I think Shitab spent a great amount of time in his speech trying to draw disanalogous examples to this particular policy, ladies and gentlemen. Whether it be the Black Panthers and the KKK apparently providing some social utility to some people. Hey, guess what, guys? Maybe we don't defend things that encourage lynching and mobbing in these circumstances and are probably different from things like not marrying a person who could probably go and marry to another church down the street, and it's probably going to be a lot harder for you to say, hey, it's okay for me to not get lynched by the KKK in these circumstances. Unfortunately, guys, not getting married, some people in this room might think is a good thing in some instances, versus getting lynched in those circumstances is not exactly analogous. The second thing is in regards to American priests propagating anti-gay rights in Uganda, ladies and gentlemen. Perhaps in those circumstances, it's disanalogous to say that sometimes we're talking about things that actually want to do good for society versus, say, do good for society, for example, charities that actually want to help the poor and actually have innocuous beliefs that people may not propagate, versus an actual institution that faces actual discrimination as well as oppression of those people. We think that Shitab needed to draw more analogous examples in this particular debate. But ladies and gentlemen, the first thing I want to look at in my speech is in regards to religion and whether we're changing religion fundamentally and how much do we really allow religions to associate to their beliefs, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, I don't think they've ever negated that the principle of all associations is a degree of exclusive membership on this side of the house. That some membership and some associations fundamentally exclude themselves from others and make other people feel morally inferior. And I think that's the key term that government never nuanced their argumentation to. Moral inferiority in respect to, for example, they accept you into your church. They allow you to attend your church. I think Gemma gave you a very clear description of how even the Catholic Church allows gay priests to be priests, insofar that you don't allow priests to practice their homosexuality, ladies and gentlemen. And we think that's a fine distinction that we're making there. That the Catholic Church, as well as many religions in society, ladies and gentlemen, allow these values in, may have some degree of moral condemnation, but never have tangible effects or tangible hurt onto these individuals in society. And we think that's the distinction that we're drawing in this side of the house. But number two, I don't think they've ever answered the question on how do religions that make themselves exclusive from each other, ladies and gentlemen. And we think that's exceptionally important. Now, how do you tell an individual that's spent his entire life believing in anti-homosexual rights or believing in bigoted ideas and still maintain that ability to hold them to that religion or make them still associate to that particular religion, ladies and gentlemen, when you tell them that you have to perform gay marriages, that your priest that you pray to every Sunday is going to be the same person that you go to every Sunday and say that I believe in what my shepherd is saying in this instance, ladies and gentlemen. We think in those circumstances, there's a far greater likelihood in you making other religious individuals lose their ability to associate with their freedom of religion in these circumstances. And we think that That's the entire point of this debate, isn't it? That we don't make value judgments in regards to whose values or whose beliefs are more important in these circumstances. That's why on the third level we provide you many alternatives. We told you there was very likely, and we think that government conceded, that the Catholic Church and many religious institutions were very willing to evolve, very willing to change, and have very much progress over society. That we've seen many denominations of churches finally accepting these groups in society. This means, as a conclusion to that first issue, ladies and gentlemen, to what extent you can associate that when individuals in this comparative can choose to opt for alternatives, can choose to opt for more personalized views of their religion versus a group of individuals that will be antagonized and hurt the individuals that you're trying to protect, we think that you would rather not impose your views onto a society, onto a group that will hurt other individuals in society. We think we win that comparative. I'll take Chika.
Sir, the point at which women's rights were given by church, till this day, women don't gain equal wages, or they can't be priests or something like that. But we do appreciate all the positive changes that did come. Tell me why we cannot manufacture constructs like that.
Most probably because all those changes occurred with a myriad of other factors as well. The natural changes within the church. The fact that we've seen the Pope change its stance today isn't by some overarching government policy that imposed the Catholic Church to be a certain way. In fact, there are no societies whatsoever that impose any sort of requirements on the Catholic Church, and it hasn't stopped it from evolving till today. Unfortunately, the factual statement still stands with us. But secondly, will churches still stay the same way? And we think that this is where I don't think that government answered this debate. Because number one, they conceded that there are many internal incentives that drive churches to change, ladies and gentlemen, aside from the historical progression. The fact that you face critique, ridicule, and many of the other things that the government brought up themselves, ladies and gentlemen, that those simple internal factors that drive society to have more progressive views, fortunately enough, throughout time, is representative within the congregation that they follow in the future, ladies and gentlemen. But at the end of that clash of whether or not churches change or not, we fundamentally don't care, ladies and gentlemen, because we think that it's their right to be able to associate insofar that it's just a moral condemnation onto others in society. The comparative that needs to be answered in this debate isn't whether I can feel morally superior to you. It's whether or not you can make an individual feel strongly enough about homosexual rights that they are willing to forsake their lifelong beliefs of anti-homosexual behavior and suddenly antagonize those beliefs then. We think they haven't answered the comparative then. At the end of this debate, this is the clash that's most important, and we think they haven't answered this, is how do you fundamentally change people's beliefs? When people are faced with confronting situations of seeing gay people in their church when they've never been used to it, when small churches are targeted, losing money, and the direct reason is because they see homosexuals in their own church, or when they see it as an attack on the state, something that religious institutions are already paranoid of, ladies and gentlemen. When they see all these factors against religious institutions, we think it's unlikely that people will ever believe that homosexual rights are a good thing. We will think the exact opposite. We are exceedingly proud to oppose.
Honestly, Madam Speaker, before this debate, I thought I was too old to learn new strategies. But I'd like to thank Max for teaching me that factually inaccurate hyperbole can be a really good strategy to try and win a debate. Because if you were to listen to Max's speech in this debate, you would believe that religious propaganda has so heavily influenced society that it has set back the rights of homosexuals, that they're being lynched, and that their lives are horrendous and trending worse. As it turns out, that strategy isn't effective. Let me explain what the world does look like. The world is a place in which a majority of states in the United States allow homosexuals to get married legally, and that is getting more significant every year, where the Pope has come out and said that the church ought not take a stance on homosexuality and what people do in their private lives, where many churches have actively and open gay bishops. That is the world in which we live. So I really want you to keep that in mind when assessing this debate. I'm going to ask 3 questions in this reply. First, what do homosexuals have now? Second, what will they get under the government team's policy? Thirdly, what will what will we lose as a result? So let's talk about what they have. So under the status quo, it is true that you can already be a gay person and be a Catholic. It is true that you can go to the church, that you can believe in the beliefs. It is true that the church will condemn you if you choose to practice that homosexuality. It is also true that you can get married in the state, even in some churches that you can get married, churches that are more progressive, churches that have accepted homosexuality. So that's the world that gay people live in right now. Okay, so what do they get if the government team is actually successful in this debate? They get a couple more churches being willing to perform ceremonies. Those churches where the people hate those individuals, are angry at those people for forcing their views upon them, things they weren't ready or willing to accept, where those people are going to be condemned within the church. So what do? They get a few more people accessing a few more marriages in a really hostile and completely terrible environment. That's the win on their side. At what cost do we get that? First, more extreme religious views. It is true that the state and religion already has a hostile relationship. It is true that in general, natural progression is occurring, but it is also true that individuals, when the state attempts to force them to accept people who they fundamentally believe go against the teachings of God or the word of God, are likely to be more ferocious in their advocacy against those people. And here's why I never really wanted to engage in the debate. We think it's kind of a good thing if many churches choose not to have an active stance against gay people in the world. We think it's kind of a good thing if behind closed doors, churches are anti the practice of homosexuality, and that's where it ends. We believe in the separation of church and state. But what do they create? They create a world in which churches are now even more vehemently advocating against things like the extension of marriage rights in the state to gay people. So the world that they create for these gay people is more hostile and is likely to have them getting less rights from the group which they actually have a right to claim to, e.g. the state. But most fundamentally and most importantly, what do they lose? They lose the many services that churches provide right now to innocent third parties who have no choice but to access those services. And the constant rhetoric that bigots ought to pay was insufficient and was frankly offensive in a debate where it was very clear that the vast majority of churches would not take up their policy and would cut those services, and poor and disenfranchised people would pay the cost of those things. At no point did they compare the huge, immediate and direct harm to those individuals who often rely on these services for things like food and healthcare to the couple more gay people who could have a couple more marriage ceremonies in a couple more churches. That's why we took this debate.
Madam Speaker, apparently it's new Asian parliamentary tactic to call a team lying and accusing the team they didn't lie. That's not the way you debate. And this side was exceptionally hypocritic because the motion reads that if you conduct this ceremony or allow participation of gays, you'll be exempted. So these Catholic Church had accepted these gay bishops and did no attempt to convert them would be exempted under our model as well, ladies and gentlemen. Where did the debate rested on? She said that, you know what, in our world, we will live in a world where even if the marriage is conducted, people will go to the church and throw Bibles at these innocent people. No, that's not a world. We told you in our policy that if these churches comply, they need to comply well. The burden on government is not to defend a hostile wedding ceremony, ladies and gentlemen. But the more important question that was posed, and the only argument that came out, ladies and gentlemen, was a mitra. A Muslim man can't go to church, therefore this is analogous. A Muslim man, if he chooses to be a Muslim, has the mosque to find solace. He has support structure there. A Christian gay man, ladies and gentlemen, cannot find that. Or even in instances he can do that, his church won't be legitimized or endorsed by the state. Or his church, ladies and gentlemen, will need to go to the extra mile, ladies and gentlemen. And they have the audacity to tell me the state should be indifferent to the people that are wrong. The POI that I was waiting to ask Mibzal was that if this is a social good and the state has deemed to be a social good, why is the state making it harder for people to actualize and reach this right, ladies and gentlemen? The more important question in this debate that government sufficiently answered was that can state engineer change? Have we done that? Do we need to continue to do that? I already highlight the moral hypocrisy that they do. Then Gemma's whole benefit was it's a kind of good thing if churches don't take a neutral stance. That's a bad thing, Gemma, because every time state does not take a stance, they're closing a door for homosexual to arise to be actualized. If the moment the states do not these churches are being neutral, ladies and gentlemen, the more and more harder it becomes to actualize the fundamental right that your state already said that is right for you to do. I explained in my debate, in my speech, that you know what, we've come to a point of time where state have authority and power to redefine religion, to tell people that it's just your personal connection with God. What will happen in our world? The bigots will still go to the bigoted church, ladies and gentlemen, and still be homophobic. But at least for people who are willing to change, and the churches that are willing to accept this change are able to allow this counter narrative to exist. If states are able to change perception about slavery and change the morally hypocritical stance that we once took to women, not allowing them to run, or not allowing them to be leaders of the religion, or not even saying that, you know what, they are really not that powerful or less equal than men, we can change that. We have capacity to do that. In their world, ladies and gentlemen, they accuse us of, you know what, we're just making the life of these men worse. We are not. We're telling these people there is a way of of analyzing religion in the way that can be homogeneous. That you can still be a gay man and a Muslim man. That there are churches and there are priests that will be willing to help you. And the more important question in this debate is that who creates that incentive to change, to exist? Under their paradigm, this incentive won't exist. The definition of religion will be one that is rigid. They will be lucky if more churches in America choose to conduct this ceremony. But under our paradigm, because state sides with the right side, ladies and gentlemen, more of this opportunity will realize. So at the end of the day, ask yourself this question. Are they for gay rights? Kinda. But why do they won't do this against the Catholic Church? Because the Catholic Church need to help the poor people. States already help the poor people, ladies and gentlemen. But more importantly, people don't become poor by not facing tax exemption. It just means that other churches will now be able to provide more for their interpretation. That's how you get the narrative. That's how you get the ability to channel the homosexual narrative, ladies and gentlemen. For far too long, we have been complicit and we have never taken action. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you will not be complicit and not take an action as well.
Are you guys taking that?
Yeah.